Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time surfer of the Enochian Aethers, and welcome back to another Darling YouTube video. On this channel, we discuss magic, religion, and everything on the fringe of esoterica. And in this video, I'm going to be continuing a conversation that I had a couple weeks ago about sex magic. So, to my shock, my pleasant surprise, YouTube actually did not censor the video and throw me into the sun and ruin my channel forever. So, I'm gonna push my luck and keep discussing this subject because it really is one of the most important concepts in metaphysics and is just part of so many religions that I think it's worth continuing the discussion. And in this video, I'm gonna be talking about sex magic within ancient pagan religion. Now, that does not mean I'm just talking about history. Modern pagans can absolutely use these techniques, but the reason why I'm distinguishing ancient paganism is that I'm not going to be talking about neo-pagan revival traditions, right? I'm not going to be discussing, say, Thelema or Wicca, but instead paganism that is more along the Reconstructionist line. And Reconstructionism is basically trying to recreate the rituals of the past and the paganism of the past. So I'm going to be discussing pagan religions across Europe and the Near East. I will not be touching on the Vedic world or the Far East, as I am just generally less informed on these areas. So without further ado, let's get into it. So sex magic is one of the most critical parts of metaphysics because sex is the human replication of the divine act of creation. So the divine act of creation is the divine masculine and the divine feminine coming together to then create output, generative output, and the universe. And it's not a literal physical act up at these high abstract levels of metaphysics, but it is a representation of what humans do. And so when you engage with sex in a ritual concept, you are doing the most powerful thing a human can do because you're recreating the generative act. And pagan religions in general, especially in the pre-modern, pre-Christian world, had a fertility component to them because they understood the power of these rituals. And so you see cross-culturally a lot of sex magic rituals in the ancient pagan world. So let's get into discussing them. So the first bit of sex magic that I want to discuss is in the oldest pagan religions we know. So civilization in general emerged from the Fertile Crescent in the Near East, with the Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian civilizations being some of the first civilizational blocks that were created. And so their religion, that Sumerian form of paganism, is the oldest paganism that we know about. And sex magic was really, really important in these cultures, specifically around the cult of Inanna. She also is the equivalent of Al-Uzza or Alat, Astarte. A lot of these goddesses in this area kind of overlap a lot. And this is this goddess of love and war. Now, I am going to use Inanna and Ishtar interchangeably. Inanna and Ishtar were pretty much used interchangeably, but there were some slight differences depending on where you were in the region. You're going to notice in the ancient pagan world, a lot of the same deities are worshipped in different places, but sometimes called something a little different or combined in different ways. And basically in her cult, this cult of love and war, she had a lot of priestesses, and these priestesses would engage in initiatic acts with people who would come to them, and they would engage in a act of sexual contact, and that would initiate them into this system because the general idea was with these goddesses of love, all acts of love and pleasure are their rituals. And so even if it wasn't done in a like super ceremonial way, because I think in the modern mind, when we think of sex magic, we think of something very ceremonial, very formal, just any of these acts would worship that goddess. And you see this continuously in all revivals of those traditions, the understanding that all acts of love and pleasure and joy and all that are actually acts of worship, which seems very strange to a mind of a culture that has been immersed in Abrahamicism, but all these acts actually do worship that goddess. Furthermore, dancing was used very heavily, and dancing seems so separate from these acts in our brains, but they actually relate a lot. And it is very heavily believed that the act of belly dancing, which is very popular in the Middle East today, actually originates from these cults as a sort of ritual dance. And so that movement of the hips, which obviously relate to the goddess's fertility. If we look at old goddess relics, we see things like the Venus of Willendorf with those big hips, right? The movement of the hips in that hypnotic way was an act of ritual. And if you've ever done a ritual that involves dance, whether that's the circle dance and you're dancing around or moving around, you understand that hypnotic trance quality of these acts and can see how that would be a powerful ritual framework to connect to these goddesses. So moving on from the Sumerian world, we understand that Venus and Aphrodite come into Europe by the way of the Mediterranean Sea. So the cult of Astarte and Inanna basically comes into Europe by crossing. And that's why you get this vision of Aphrodite emerging from the water coming into Greece. So you see this sort of movement across the Mediterranean Sea as the introduction of the love cult to Europe. Now, of course, there is a mythic telling of that. It's not told in that exact way, but that is what happened, because as civilizations and nations moved and expanded and traded, so did their gods come along with them, right? The gods move with the people. And so when we see Aphrodite and Venus entering into Europe, we see the love cult hitting the European shores, and the cults around these goddesses very much involved these type of rituals as well, but not in such an initiatic framework, like that idea of the priestess initiating the acolyte did not exist in the same way, but instead the idea that pleasure itself was ritual was intrinsic to these cults. And you basically get this really interesting thing coming out of this world where love starts getting broken down into multiple components, because the pagan religion of these countries was still that kind of fertility love thing, but instead of seeing love as wholly what they would call eros, which is very much what this cult of Inanna centered around, because Inanna had that connection between love and war, pleasure and pain, violence, and all of that, right? That all fits within eros. And there's actually a specific deity in these regions known as Eros or Cupid that was the personification of that type of love. But you also see the Greeks beginning to break it down further. And so as they break down love into things like agape, which is the love for the divine and the self, you begin seeing the love cult emerge into something much bigger. And so what's so interesting is you look at the rights of women in the Hellenistic world, is that they had this interesting understanding. So Venus is the feminine version of love, and Mars is that masculine form of love. If you look at the male and the female logos that we use in modern society, it is the Venus sigil and the Mars sigil, the glyphs for them respectively. And so Venus becomes this very beauty, romance-centered form of love, and Mars is the more physical and obviously also has that war connotation. And so what's interesting is we have this connection with the Inanna cult and Eros. We connect Mars to Eros. There was a lot of women who would intentionally utilize Eros, sometimes even working with the god Eros himself, to bring out philia. And philia was that more romantic or friendly, like that more familial type of romantic love out of them. And so you use Mars in order to get to Venus. And so you see this very interesting interchange between these two very different interpretations of the love and sex cult. So sticking in the Hellenistic world a little bit longer, I do think it is worth discussing the cult of Dionysus. So Dionysus is a Greek god of, mostly people associate him with wine, but he does rule over madness, excess, revelry, and kind of this very chaotic force of nature. And politically in the ancient world, there were actually some restrictions posed against the cult of Dionysus, and the cult of Dionysus kind of was in conflict with some of the other cults of the region, specifically in the way they operated their rituals. And the rituals of the cult of Dionysus actually overlap a lot with sex magic, though they don't 100% overlap, because the Dionysian mysteries were this whole school of mystical thought. And basically what happened is you would initiate into the cult of Dionysus and you would engage in the Bacchanalia, and basically this would be running around skyclad and engaging in revelry and hedonism and group activities, and hunting and violence, and this whole sort of explosion of these hedonistic forces. And so you get later on philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche creating this Apollonian and Dionysian dialectic, of the Apollonian being the ordered, the upright, the proper, and the Dionysian being the hedonistic, the chaotic. And so you get some really interesting sort of philosophical extrapolations off of this, but the cult of Dionysus was very much real, and they had these very complicated initiatory mystical systems within this. I think they often get reduced to these crazy hedonists who just did whatever they wanted. And of course there was hedonism intrinsic to the cult of Dionysus. It would be historical revisionism to say otherwise, and I'm not going to. That was a huge part of it. But there was an initiatory structure to this, because something that we do as humans is we try to think with our head instead of our heart very frequently. I am guilty of this, right? We try to detach ourselves from our emotions, and I think Avoidance is something that a lot of people struggle with, the avoidant attachment style being the most extreme version of it. But basically people trying to think fully rationally and deny the primal and the instinctual aspect of the human psyche. And the cult of Dionysus challenged those assumptions and forced people to sink into that other part of their mind and think with their heart, which is why the heavily emotional Dionysian cult was so associated with madness and mania and these kind of mental breaks. But they were not true mental breaks because they were using all that emotion and using all that sensation in order to bring something out of the self. The Greeks had this big idea of catharsis or purgation as the way to get rid of spiritual pollution. And you cannot have a moment of catharsis that gets rid of all your ick and your pollution and your vice and all these bad things, right? Without having a moment of extreme stimulation or interaction. And so purgative catharsis rituals were not always sexual in nature. Many of them weren't. Many of them were just physically arduous. But this as a conduit for our experiences is very powerful. And the entire idea of asceticism is very much involved in mysticism. You see in modern forms of mysticism, like within Sufi groups, like dancing for extended periods of time while being jacked up on caffeine as an entheogenic pathway, being a big part of those mysteries. So that is the cult of Dionysus in the shortest version possible. So moving out of the Mediterranean region to other parts of Europe, I think it is good to look at Northern Europe. Within the Nordic pagan and Germanic pagan and Teutonic religious groups, sexual magic was much less on the forefront. It was not as heavily discussed compared to the Mediterranean world, and especially the Sumerian world, where that was very central in their expression of paganism, but it was still there. I think a lot of people, when they think of Nordic paganism, think of like Viking LARPing and pretending to be Vikings, but fail to realize that Vikings were only a small percentage of the Nordic society. It was like a job, like, you know, there had to be people farming too. There had to be people running things too. Like, it's not like everyone was running around pillaging or whatever. And there were actually, within the Nordic pagan world, a lot of different types of magic that existed. I think people mostly associate Nordic magic with the mysteries of the runes, but there was a lot more going on. And there was specifically this form of magic in the Nordic world known as satyr. And satyr was this tradition that a lot of people kind of just call witchcraft, but it wasn't witchcraft. I think that the term witchcraft gets used just so broadly towards all mysticism that it loses meaning. And so calling satyr like Nordic witchcraft, I just think is a disturbance to what it is, because I think what satyr actually is and can better be described as is a form of kind of shamanism, because it was a lot of use of trance and altered states of consciousness. And that's actually a very common through line in the use of sexual ritual in the ancient pagan world, is as a altered state of consciousness, because it does, like, when we descend into this primal state of union, because what sex fundamentally is it's the dissolution of boundaries, right? It's a dissolution of the masculine and the feminine to become together to create something else. Even if literal procreation does not happen, it is that boundary being broken, right? The line between me and you are now together, right? We are one, we are unity. And of course, the metaphysical through line of everything is all is one. In the simplest form. And so what happens with the satyr traditions is it's a lot about transgressing these boundaries. And so things like astral projection or the soul leaving the body was heavily used. The use of entheogenic practices also pops up. And entheogenic, for those who aren't familiar, is the utilization of substances to induce altered states of consciousness, right? That could be as simple as the Sufis who drink black tea while they do their dancing, to things like psychedelic journeying. Now, with satyr, it is not 100% know exactly what sex's role was within these traditions, but it is highly speculated by historians, and there's a lot of evidence pointing to that it did exist. Now, the thing with satyr is it was not like institutionalized in the same way like the cult of Dionysus was. It wasn't like because the cult of Dionysus, right, like that was a physical group of people. Satyr was more like decentralized, and since it was amongst women, it was not as documented exactly what they were doing, but satyr definitely had a sexual component to it, according to most historic records. Now, I do want to note there were men in the Nordic world who did partake in satyr, but it was not common, and it was seen as somewhat effeminate. There is a specific myth in the Nordic mythology where a male god engages in satyr, and that is a whole thing. So I think that is also worth bringing up. Now, looking further amongst Northern Europe, I think it is worth taking a look at the Celtic world, and I am going to use the term Celtic pagan. Now, I do want to be clear, Celtic pagan is a blanket term. It is not an actual movement, right? There are many groups of people within the Celtic Isles. They had overlapping religious traditions, but they were not a singular group. I'm just going to speak in a singular group because when it comes to sexual magical traditions, they kind of did a lot of the same thing. But please note that these are different groups and it does get more complicated, especially as we look at revival movements. If you are going to reconstruct ancient Celtic paganism, you should do it the service of considering it different things like being a Welsh pagan or an Irish pagan. As well, I want to bring up that Druidry is a practice that is heavily associated with Celtic paganism, but not all Celtic pagans are Druids. Druidry is a very specific path within these traditions, much like how rune magic and satyr is a specific path within Nordic paganism, not the whole of what Nordic paganism is. So within the Celtic world, sexual ritual is used in a different way because it is used in a very season-centric thing. So in the ancient pagan world, we have to understand that nature plays a massive role in the metaphysics and the religion and the traditions. And within the Celtic world, this was very much true. And so sexual ritual was used to denote the passing of seasons, specifically around the spring. So there was this holiday that is now observed by neo-pagans. There's a Wiccan version of it, but the ancient version and the Wiccan version do have some distinctions because Wicca is not like reconstructed Celtic paganism. Wicca is kind of its own thing with its own influences, but Beltane did exist, and there is a Beltane fire festival that is done every year in the Celtic nations. That's really cool. But in the ancient form of Beltane, right, there was a lot of imagery used that evoked sexual symbolism. In general, when we look at the ritual objects used in these festivals, you are going to see things like poles or rods, right, which have very blatant symbolism to them, or the use of flowers, right, as a feminine correspondence. Now, when we look at Beltane, a thing that was common is couples that wanted to get married but did not want to go through a more traditional marriage route would run off together on Beltane and have these sort of like secret marriages and would unite physically in this way. Marriage and sex magic in the Celtic world are not actually that distinct. They are not like hard dichotomies. I think in the modern world, we have this like Madonna whore Freudian way of thinking where we think if someone engages in sexual mysticism, they must be promiscuous. But in reality, the marital act is still a sexual magical act. And so marriage rites, like the entire concept that you need to consummate a marriage to be valid, is a sexual ritual because you are using that consummation act as part of the marriage ceremony and as part of the symbolism of marriage as the moment when the boundaries between the couple are fully dissolved and they become one flesh, right? Now, within the Celtic world, we see this pretty heavily. There was a tradition known as hand fasting, where the hands would be tied together, and this would be a representation of marriage instead of like the passing of rings or going in front of a minister. You would go in the woods and you would tie the hands together. There are a lot of modern pagans who recreate hand fasting, and some of them put it into broader wedding ceremonies or do it on their own, but it was a spiritual version of marriage. And the idea of binding, I think, is really important to discuss. Binding is when you are unified with another person. If you've ever done a binding ritual, you will tie two candles together. Like let's say you're falling in love with someone and you want to solidify your connection. You would do what's called a binding ritual, where you take two red candles and you tie them together and you burn them down. And as they burn, the candle's separation dissolves and the wax comes together and they are tied together, right? And so to symbolize longer term commitment, binding is heavily used in the Celtic world to symbolize this connection. And because we're talking about the dissolution of boundaries, I think it does kind of put it itself into sex magic, because sex magic is the dissolution of boundaries and the unification. It's all about coming together and no longer seeing ourselves as separate individuals, but as a collective pair. Even if that is not in a marriage framework and is done individually, that is still part of what is going on a very last thing I want to discuss, and this is kind of speaking to people interested in pagan reconstructionism and bringing back ancient pagan traditions in the modern world. How would you begin these practices if that is something you want to engage with? Because obviously in the modern world, we do not have the infrastructure of the ancient pagan world. We are not living way back in the day when you could just initiate into the cult of Inanna or the cult of Dionysus by approaching a priestess. So if you are interested in reconstructing these things, first of all, you need to find other people with shared interest and beliefs and form a formal or informal organization. As well, I really suggest looking into the historical records of exactly how all of these things were done, and then combining it with more modern pagan understanding of metaphysics and theology, because that can give you a little bit more insight on how this begins. As well, I would like to say, if you are going to engage in any of these practices in a ritual context, you need to make sure everyone you are engaging with knows what is going on and is aware of what these things mean. I see, and this is why I've always been so hesitant to discuss sexual magic, even though I think it is so important, and I think people are engaging in it whether they believe it or not. If you are married and you consummated your marriage, you are a sex magician. I hate to tell this to you, but this is how modern Western marriage rites work on a spiritual level. And if you've done any sort of like ordeal experience where you've gone into a ritual and you've kind of been forced to challenge yourself in this type of way, like you have as well. But what I want to say is some people use these topics to be predatory, and that is completely not okay. And I want to make it very clear that you cannot do that. I recommend beginning these practices with a partner you have who has shared spiritual interest or is open-minded to spiritual interest. I do not think you should just thrust this upon people. As well, I think you need to develop a devotion to the gods, because all of these rituals are about devotion. They are not about pleasure. I mean, they are about pleasure. They're about pleasure as a conduit to something higher and something more metaphysical, but it's not just about like pure carnal pleasure. It's about devotion. And so if you're not including that devotion element to these things, you are not doing this. As well, you need to understand the prioritization of love and beauty as part of the pagan worldview, right? The Christian worldview is about death, and it is not about these things. It does not see beauty and unity as these high, beautiful, profound, sacred things, and paganism does. So you need to challenge that mindset. Because intention is not everything, but intention matters, especially with rituals like this. So you need to go in this with a sacred mindset and a mindset about transformation, not about like utilizing spiritual things and real gods to just get yourself off because you think it sounds cool. Like, take it seriously and see it as a real religious process that you are engaging with, and don't don't reduce this down to like some fun little thing where I get to role play as a witch. Like, these are serious metaphysical things. If that's not what you are interested in, you are not interested in this in a magical perspective, and you're not really doing it. So take it seriously and consider the value of the gods in your life, and think about how does this work with the gods that you worship. Like, if you worship a love goddess, that's very clear, but if you worship, say, other types of gods, you should consider like where this falls in your personal practice, because I think having a cohesive practice is very important. And my very last point, this should not be the only form of spiritual practice you have. You should be doing daily rituals, devotions, prayers, mysticism. Like, this should not be the whole of your practice, because while this is one of the most metaphysically profound acts a human can do, it's not the only metaphysically profound act a human can do, and you should consider all those other things too. So that's all I have to say about this video. If you guys want me to discuss this topic in relation to modern ceremonial magic or Wicca or something, let me know. I'm thinking of following up with a video like that, because there just is so much to discuss. As well, if you guys are interested in a video on this stuff in the Abrahamic traditions, that would be really, really cool. And if you know anyone who is a Hindu Tantra practitioners, please comment their name down below. I really would like to interview one on my channel. And I just can't really find anyone who feels like the right fit. So if you guys have any ideas, please let me know. This has been your host, Georgina Rose, or Dot Darling. You can find me under every platform under the sun. On Patreon, this channel is supported through Patreon. This video is like very possibly going to be demonetized. So if you like me discussing these subjects that literally put my channel at risk to discuss, because I really don't want to get banned, please join the Patreon. You also get videos early. You get an extra video every month. You get ritual guides, which is where I write like direct instruction for ritual for you to practice. And if you're in a high enough tier, I will mentor you and guide you through spiritual problems you have and help you develop your practice on a one-on-one level. I do those calls via Zoom, so that's really cool as well. I also host the podcast, The Postmodern Iconoclast, which you can listen to on the YouTube channel or on most podcasting platforms. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you subscribe for 93 days, you'll meet your holy guardian angel, and you never need to do these rituals again. All right, see you guys next time. Bye.